Amy here, coming to you today with the first video from chapter 11, in which we will begin to look at Gregor Mendel and the patterns of inheritance that he discovered. This chapter is divided into 4 sections. The first video here today, we're just going to give a background to Gregor Mendel and why he chose pea plants. The next video will look at section 11.2 and some of his laws and crosses, the law of segregation and independent assortment that he talked about. The third video, we apply those patterns of inheritance to human traits and human diseases. And then 11.4, some of the traits, genetics that don't follow some of the rules that he established, kind of beyond that. So there are some exceptions to that. So we're going to split the chapter up in here into 4 parts. Okay, Gregor Mendel, we're talking about research that he did was done back in like the 1800s, about the 1860s. And during that time period, the blending concept of inheritance was generally accepted. Now, throughout the ages, since human history, humans have always noticed that things pass on traits, that things will look like their parents. And there was always a lot of interest in how genetics work, even though they didn't know about DNA or chromosomes or that kind of stuff, because it was important, whether you were breeding and raising crops or different kinds of animals, to have the best crop, have the best animal for whatever purpose you needed it for. And so there's always been interest in how traits are passed. Kind of the popular way of thinking during Mendel's time was this blending theory. And that's just if you cross a red flower with a white flower, you get a blend, you get pink flowers. Okay? And then if you ever got, so it was kind of an intermediate type trait or a blend or a mix of the two parents. And obviously it's not always that way. So if they found something that maybe was flowers that were just totally red later on, they just contributed it to instability in the genetics. And so something was popping up because it wasn't stable. It wasn't staying like it should be. So they didn't have a real good reason how to explain that. Okay, Mendel's findings were in contrast to this. He said, he found that this blending thing was not really the case in what he was researching. And he formulated what we call the particulate theory. Particulate being that there is some particle, some genetic particle. Remember, they didn't know about DNA yet or chromosomes. Okay, so there is some kind of particle in living things, in the cells, that are passed on, that have the genetic information on them. And he proposed 2 laws, the laws of segregation and the law of independent assortment, okay, and how these genes were reshuffled as they passed from generation to next. But we'll look more specifically at those next video. Kind of some background about Gregor Mendel. He was an Austrian monk, studied at the University of Vienna. The story goes he kind of grew up on a farm. He enjoyed being outside. He enjoyed biology. And this combination of these 2 things were important, that he applied math to the science that he was studying. Okay, and he conducted breeding experiments with the garden pea plant, Pisum sativum, okay, which there's a picture of just the regular old garden pea plant that we still grow today. And he was actually working on this. He was substitute teaching at a local high school while he was at the monastery because he did have a math and science degree. So they probably reached out and recruited him to be a substitute teacher. So while he was substitute teaching, he is when he kind of began these experiments on these pea plants. And he was being the mathematician, was very particular about keeping track of his numbers and recording his data from his experiments. This really helped him, we think, sort of stumble upon his finding and his laws. And again, this is the early 1860s. We didn't know about cells. He did not have a microscope. We didn't know about chromosomes. We didn't know about DNA, all of that stuff. So it's actually rather amazing how close, once we did know about DNA and stuff, about how well his experiments and his inheritance kind of matched up with what happens with chromosomes and DNA. Just amazing that 200 years, 150, 200 years ago, that this dude was right on, kind of figured things out. Why use the pea plant? Well, number one, it was easy to cultivate. It was easy to get seeds. You just needed a plot of dirt, and you could grow rows and rows of peas. It didn't take long, one growing season, or he could stretch out a couple generations of plants in one growing season. It could take 60 days or something like that. And this is an important one here. They self-pollinated, and I'll show you that here on the next couple slides. Okay, they self-pollinated, so there wouldn't be pollen flying all through the garden. Okay, they wouldn't be cross-pollinating and trading genes and stuff, but they would keep their own sort of DNA unless he decided to cross-pollinate something. He could specifically do that, and I'll show you this in a couple future slides here. There were many true breeding varieties available where they just took the same traits and let the same thing self-pollinate over many generations, and so it always gave the same traits. So true breeding always gave the same traits, and those traits were very easy to distinguish. This is just a little chart showing the 7 traits. He picked round versus wrinkled seeds. The cotyledon, which is kind of the first seed leaf that we see poke up through the dirt, as yellow versus green. Flower color, again, very easily distinguishable. We didn't need no microscope. You could very easily look at the peas or the plant and distinguish, were the flowers white or the flowers purple. The pods, were they like full or were they bumpy or constricted? Okay, were the pods green or were the pods yellow? The stem, okay, where were the flowers? Were they axial? Were they coming off of the sides of the stem? That'd be trait number 6. Or were they terminal? Were they all out here at the ends? And size. Was the pea plant tall? Was it short? There was no like in-betweens, all that. It was either short or tall. And so these are the 7 traits that we find in his old notebooks, easily distinguishable, easy just to look at the pea plant and say, is it this or is it this? And he could record his numbers and keep track of all of his data. Again, to help him understand why pea plants work so well, to help you understand why pea plants work so well for him, is just we have to look at the anatomy of how they reproduce sexually. Okay, the stamen. The stamen is the male part of the plant, where you have these long filaments with a little anther on top. The anther would produce the male sex cell pollen. Okay, the male gamete, which would be analogous to sperm in animals, whereas the carpel is the female part of the plant, and you have this long ovary here with the ovules, or eggs would be the gamete. Okay, ovules, which we compare a lot of times to eggs in animals, with this long style or neck and the stigma up on top, where the pollen that was released here, okay, the pollen, and this is all enclosed kind of within a flower. Okay, so these petals would all enclose that. So if you remember previously, I said that these things would self-pollinate. Okay, this pollen would land on kind of the sticky end of the stigma up here, and all the pollen from one flower would just self-pollinate all the eggs, okay, which would eventually become the pea seeds, okay, the little embryos, little pea plant embryos within that pod. Now, one thing that normally they self-pollinated, but that he could do is he could cross-pollinate. Okay, so he could decide, like, here's one with purple flowers, here's one with white flowers, I'm going to cross them. So he would cut away, he would snip off the male parts of the flowers on one plant, and he would bring in a brush with pollen from another plant, like with white flowers. So over here was a pea plant with white flowers. Okay, he would take his brush, get some pollen over here, and bring it over to the purple plant, put the pollen on there, and he could very carefully, he could control which plants he was crossing with which. So again, you didn't have pollen all flying through the garden and stuff crossing with each other. Everything would self-pollinate unless he chose to specifically take pollen from one plant to another plant. And all peas are yellow when one parent produces yellow seeds. And something interesting happened, and we'll get into this a little bit in the next video, but a little cliffhanger here. When he crossed, I guess not purple and white, but let's say that this plant had all yellow peas, and this one over here had all green peas. When he crossed yellow pea plant with a plant that had green peas, all of the peas were yellow. Okay, the green trait disappeared. And he was like, what's going on? And this really puzzled him. And this kind of takes us into our next video and some of his first experiments.